as we begin our session today, I'd like to welcome our three guests. My name is Carmel Doyle, and I'm a faculty member here at Queen's College. To my left is Dr. Michelle Rebidoux, who is also a professor here at Queen's College and at Memorial University, and who is the artist who painted this wonderful painting behind us. To my right is Marianne Stevens, a graduate of Queen's College, and right now someone who is pursuing her
Doctor of Ministry and Spiritual Formation
at
Tyndale College in Toronto.
Okay, so she's continuing the academic journey, and Dr. Gerard Whitty, who is also a teacher here a professor here at Queen's College. So we've come together today to engage in a conversation on lament in today's world and looking at it somewhat through the lens of the Lenten season. And the gospel that we chose as being representative and possibly the one most well known by most people, both inside and even outside the faith community, is the story of Jesus' time in the wilderness and what a wilderness experience might be like. And if at all this time that we're experiencing might be a wilderness or not a wilderness time. So I think that what I'll do for the beginning is just read through the gospel for the first Sunday of Lent, even though we're close to the end, but that whole theme of being in the wilderness is the Lenten theme. So it's from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 4. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give you if you fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only Him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. The Gospel of Christ. So, that very dramatic, and for me anyway, both two things, symbolic and heart-wrenching, sense of what it's like to be in a wilderness, to be in the place that's not connected to what you normally see as your life. It's quite evocative. And the notion of what happens sometimes when you're in a wilderness, your strengths and your weaknesses become quite obvious to you. You can't hide from them. There's nowhere to hide. So with that as a kind of an invitation, I'm going to see what any of you might want to think about, share with us on that whole theme of wilderness, strengths, weaknesses, not knowing where we're going.
In the language of ritual studies, the academic language of ritual studies, being in the wilderness is what is called being in a liminal space.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in that liminal space, you're not really who you are, you're not really who you were, and you're not really who you're going to become yet. And you really don't know who you are. You have no foundation, you have nowhere to stand. And it's like you can't hold yourself up because you have nothing to hold yourself up with. So you're put into a state which is entirely vulnerable. The best you can do is trust in a relationship with God, but beyond that, you really are completely at a loss. But it is considered a transitional space. So there's the idea that, well, you're not going to stay that way, but you don't know necessarily what the next state is either.
Okay, so in terms of today's world, and I'm going to say our Christian communities in particular.
Would it be, you talked about the idea of identity, and when you said strength and weaknesses, Carmel, my thought immediately went to needs. So Satan came to Jesus with this temptation of what do you want and not what do you need. And Jesus very clearly identified where he was and what he didn't need. And that defined who he was. He gave a complete explanation of who he was. But in that identity forming space, it's almost like a womb.
Mm.
There's this sense of created personality becoming, but it's almost like it's coming out of, you talked about it so well, the chaos or the swirling kind of, the not knowing, and then all of a sudden there's this peeling or taking away of what is not necessary or what is not needed or what is rejected in favor of who Jesus knows himself to be.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be for us too.
Well, Belton Lane, on hard preaching one time, said, "Tell me your environment and I'll tell you who you are."
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this case, it's Jesus' identity. Who is he? Because at his baptism, he was told, he's God's beloved child, right?
Yeah.
So he goes out to the desert to be tempted, and the temptations always begin by, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. So in the desert, Jesus has to figure out who he is. It is a question, to me, of identity and transformation. Rosemary Hoffman wrote this great book on liminal space, right? You're neither here nor there, you're betwixt and between, but that's where you work out your identity, right? And who are you? And so Jesus comes from Nazareth, a very comfortable place, Nazareth, and he enters into the wilderness, which is a place of total disorder. And he has to figure out who he is. But he does, because when he comes out, he goes to the synagogue and he says, "I'm the Messiah, and here's what I'm going to be doing." So I think you're right. For me, anyway, what I hear in all this is, who is he, right? And where is he going with stuff? Not only is it who he is, but what's he going to do? What's his ministry is, right? And I do think
the choices in that space too.
Yeah,
right?
and I think this is what the church has to do,
Choices.
right? I mean, I think the church has lost its identity. I think Christians have lost their identity. Right?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about Jesus' responses to Satan in that context is that he, if, like you say, every temptation begins with, if you are the Son of God, and he was just told, you are my beloved Son. But what he doesn't do is appropriate that identity to himself. He doesn't say, okay, I'm the Son of God, therefore, this is me, this is my identity. He doesn't actually do that, because every single response is basically a reference back to God. It's like, I live from every word that comes out of the mouth of God, or don't put your God to the test, or, God is the true ruler, right? And the idea is that he never does appropriate his identity as Son of God, because if he tried to appropriate it just to himself, then he would no longer be the Son of God, because you can't be the Son without there being a Father of whom you are the Son. So everything is a reference back to the Father for him. And that's the only way he can continue to be the Son, is by always deferring to the Father. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, the church, I suppose, one of the temptations always from the time that it became the kingdom of the Christendom, right, was always the temptation that this is the that's the truth, that's the finality, that's the fullness of it, right, without reference back to God.
For the commentary in the Message Bible, right, mm-hmm. Jesus refused to work magic. He refuses to entertain, and he refuses power. So he's basically saying this is not what God does. But when he comes to the synagogue, he says, "No, this is what God does. I come for good news to the poor." All that message of the Messiah. Which is what the Father will be about too, right? Father of orphans and widows in Scripture.
So in the sense and the notion that in Lament we're called to actually name what we've lost and what our relationship to that has meant. So that we can lament. Mm-hmm. But until the naming, the very clear naming of what we've lost is complete, in a way we're unable to do anything else, because we're still caught, I'll use the words, in the thralls of what was. We're looking backward instead of I won't even say forward. We haven't yet come to look at the right now of it. And I think one of the things for Jesus was that the desert gave him a real chance to look at the right now of where he was and consider, as you said, the various options that are there.
Well, I think you're right. Even from my own experience, to name something accurately is the thing.
Yes.
It's not just, widely naming something. Like a child abuse, for instance, you've got to be able to name it, right? And don't forget, I remember being on the council priests for our diocese when all this started, and Twink Newman, who wrote the legislation, had to come in and tell us and explain the language. We didn't know what we were talking about, had no clue what we were talking about, right? And but she helped name it, But then, of course, there's one thing to name it in that context, but to name it in a wider culture is a totally different thing, right? But coming back to the temptation or the testing in the wilderness, one of the things that has always struck me is that if Jesus is tested and he's the Son of God, then God is always with us in the suffering. Like God is not absent.
Yeah.
So in all the struggles that we go through, the violence and the struggling with stuff and losing stuff and all that, but God is not absent. God is in it, right?
There's a hymn, Jesus knows all about our weakness.
Mm-hmm.
That it's based on the temptations of Christ.
Yeah.
And the idea that he has well, I guess it's also scripture. He has been tempted in every way and understands anything that could possibly happen to us.
And I think naming it lament traditionally is a liturgy, right? It's a ritual. And,
It is. It's a formalized, structured piece that's not just created by an individual and kept to the individual. It seeks to become the voice of the community. And the only way it can become the voice of the community is if the community hears it, recognizes it for it's the truth or lack of truth that it has, and embraces that.
And I think it's not a head trip either, right? It's gut wrenching, right?
It's a what?
It's gut wrenching.
Yes.
It's emotional, right? I mean, the violence, the destruction. I mean, it's not something that's ritual. Doesn't appeal to the head, more to the metaphoric mind, I think, and heart. You know what I mean?
If we look at the laments in Scripture, they're extremely graphic about the loss of life, about the tearing away of families, about the total and utter destruction of everything that gave us our identity and called us together. And that sense that right now, it's gone. Who are we now? If we no longer have, in terms of the Hebrew people, our temple. If we no longer have our priests. If we no longer have our young men and women.
People of the Word.
You want to say a bit more?
Because the actual expression of the thought in the written word is transcribing the experience into the word that can be shared. The word, the living word, the Christ.
Yes. On the
It's a cry to God and an expression to God. It's not a word that's written to no one. That expression in written form is actually an effort to relate to.
It's about relationship.
Yeah.
Even though the story takes place in the wilderness, as you were saying, it's always the son can only be son in relation to the father. But it's always about maybe remembering the relationship, reforging the relationship, living into a new aspect of the relationship.
It's very Trinitarian.
Yes, it is. And it's interesting in that reading that it begins that it's the Spirit who leads Jesus into the wilderness.
Yeah. So the Father to the Son is very incarnational. I was thinking that when you were saying that. It's almost like this big metaphor of Jesus, the Spirit coming and resting in Jesus, the Father's, living through him. But there's no other person. There's just, Satan and Jesus. So that part of relating it to other people, the story's written there for us to know. Who told the story? Who told Matthew what to write? Or who told that story again so that we would know, so that we would have that picture to understand and relate to? That interests me greatly.
Believe it or not, you wouldn't have the word if you didn't have liturgy.
Yes.
So, the synagogue comes out of the exile, and so when they get down into Babylon, it strikes them. We're not going to be able to forget the stories if we don't have a way to tell them. And so you get 7 or 8 men to form a synagogue and do a liturgy, and within that liturgy you tell the stories, but then the stories eventually get written down. It's the same thing with Matthew. They were celebrating the death and resurrection of Christ, but part of that was always the story, right? As they remembered it, because all oral, right? And again, I think listening, we kind of had to bring this home, right?
Yes.
As far as I'm concerned, in my experience, to be a Christian today is to be in the desert. It is absolutely a terrible place to be at the moment. And this story is the beginning of Lent. And it's there for a reason, I think, liturgically speaking, because Easter is about celebrating you as a child of God, a son or daughter of God, right? But from my experience, people that I meet and run the day, right, they're having a real difficult time coming to terms with being a child of God in our culture today, right? And it is a real desert, I think. It's a real wilderness.
And to get back then, for us, in that notion of naming the story. The question is how do we tell the story? What do we choose to tell? So what are some of the things right now, from the point of view of the Christian community, as we know it, that need to be named? Fearlessly, boldly named. Because we've changed. Prior to the pandemic, I think we thought that if we just did more, the same thing harder, things could get better. We spent a lot of time doing that for the last 20 or 30 years.
So are you thinking in terms of what was named to Jesus? So
I'm thinking of what is, you could use those as maybe indicators of something to look for.
materialism,
Power.
and corruption of relationship, infamy.
I'm not sure if this will help us name it more, but can I just ask, Gerard, what do people say makes it difficult for them to be seen as, to feel themselves a child of God? Why would that be a difficult thing?
Because they feel betrayed. And that would be my first immediate response, right?
Betrayed by God or by the church or by
Not
who?
by everyone, but especially by the church and by the leadership in the church.
And God let it happen.
Hopefully, again, I think it's the work of the Spirit. I think the Spirit is behind all this in the church today. I mean, I don't think you can't blame it on child sexual abuse or anything like that. It may be a trigger point, but this was all happening before the 90s, okay? Like when I was ordained, 90% of Catholics went to church, 90% of Anglicans went to church, and the United Church. All our churches were full.
Baptists even more.
Yeah, that was in the early 70s, late 60s. By the time the 80s rolled around, it was down to about 55. By the 90s, it rolled down, it was about 15. So, what's going on in our churches is not recent. And I go back to what you said, the church is a church of power. The Anglican Church was tangled up with the British Empire. The Roman Catholic Church was tied to the Holy Roman Empire. The Lutheran Church tied to the Lutheran Empire. Dutch Reform to the Dutch Empire, right? And so their experience of church was basically one of power. You couldn't get a job if you weren't a Catholic in the Catholic school system, right? And that all of that stuff, that the exercise of power in our churches, that's what's, I think, that's one of the things we have to name clearly and not be afraid to do it, right? The violence that people suffered at the hands of churches, we don't even know it half the time. Some of us know it, others don't, right? Like I remember a priest here who was with the denominational education committee. There was a Catholic teacher over on Bell Island who married a Salvation Army, and he became a Salvation Army, and he was fired. And so I said to them, why was he fired? Well, because he had a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I said, well, church, isn't that a good thing? Well, not to him it wasn't. So it's that kind of mentality, you can destroy people's lives, and that people's lives were destroyed, right? But how do you name that kind of violence, right? And how do you get beyond it, right?
The religious tradition, which didn't just sort of materialize out of nowhere, again, recognize the importance of naming, calling the community together to remember and to tell the story. and to tell it in its completeness, and not starting with the head level, but with the heart and the gut, which is an extremely uncomfortable place for us individually, usually. It's certainly uncomfortable in families when truths get named that others don't want to recognize. In churches, we'll turn a blind eye and maybe talk about it when we get away to one another very quietly. In governments, I mean, we're seeing it all the time played out on the world stage, but that notion of naming, actually naming and saying what happened, I think movements like the Black Lives Matter, which refuse to let anyone else name what's happening but those who experienced it, that Me Too movement, that started to name something that very quickly morphed from something that was just about the rich and powerful to how pervasive that was in all of society. And the people became empowered. And the interesting thing was, in the telling of the stories, those who may have felt alienated recognized in you and your story maybe the beginning of a new community.
I think all those movements, going back to that idea of relationship, people required a certain level of safety or confidence that the risk they were taking was mitigated by the possibility that they would be listened to and that they could bring about change. And that happened because someone listened to them. And the story was shared and grew. And like there's a movie out right now about the Me Too movement. I don't know if it's a recent movie or if it's a couple years old actually, but it's about the story of how that story broke with Megan. I can't remember their names.
Yeah.
The two journalists in New York City. Anyways, and how they worked on that story, and it's actually fascinating because both of the women involved had so much going on in their lives at the time. They were young women with children and husbands, and they just felt that it was such an important story and it took a hold of them. I'm sure it was the Spirit actually at work. But they pursued the story with the women, who they had threads to follow, and they had to bring these women to a feeling of unity or of a shared story to be able to bring them to the place where they were willing to take that risk.
I think that's one whole major piece of
knowing we're not alone.
Yes, knowing you're not alone. So safety, yes, but there's another side to it, and that's the outrage. Sometimes you take the risk even if you don't think you're going to be safe, because outrage propels it. I didn't say at the beginning about the reason for the empty chair here. The empty chair has two pieces to it. One is those who are listening and they can engage themselves in it. It can also be the space for the voices that aren't heard. There is the story of all those who aren't here and why they're not here. I think that within our traditions today, where there are more whatever we want to put the denominational tag to, than there are active, this is a very important reminder to us.
Oh, I stopped there. I remember in Jewish tradition, there's always an empty chair for Elijah,
Right?
who was the prophet.
Yep.
So like your empty chair, probably for me when I looked at it, I just thought, well, that's the chair for the prophet. Whoever the prophets may be in our culture around this kind of thing, right?
In the desert.
Yeah.
Very often.
Again, as what I'm listening, I mean, the paradigm for all of this actually is the Exodus, right? I just happen to be reading Numbers. Now, I don't read Numbers, but I do try to read it during Lent, right? You know, I read the passage where the people were in the desert. It took them like 40 years, you know. 40 years in the desert is a long time, right? But, you know, and this is a part I want to come to. There was a time when they wanted to be back in Egypt where there was leeks and onions and cucumbers, you know, this was the land of plenty, and they're out here eating quail until it comes out of their nostrils, and manna, you know, and they
Dried, stringy food.
and they want to go back, right? And I'm afraid our churches are wanting to go back to the 30s and the 40s and the 50s to where everything was clear and everything was perfectly in place. As some people, anyone who lived through it will not agree with this, of course. You know, because the churches back in the 30s and 40s was dysfunctional as well, right? But it's a paradigm in a way from Lament, you know. It's anamnetic, you know, like in the sense that you have to remember, but in the remembering it's present. You know, it's always present, you know. And the Passover is remembering all of this and believing that it's here now and it will be in the future. But trying to lament all of that and put words to it and live it.
One of the big things is hearing the voices of the dispossessed and the injured, and those who've walked away because they can no longer bear to be where they are. So maybe one of the things, if we're looking today, and not just for the church, but for our broader society, like the church is like one little lens that in many ways resembles larger society with so many what we thought were the main bulwarks of society that kept us connected. We're seeing so much crumble. And it's usually the ones who have the stories are the ones who are never invited in to tell their stories. So whether it's in the larger community, whether it's in our Christian communities, and maybe even within our families and friends, the ones who've left, like how do we hear and engage their stories so that we may be changed?
Well, and her speaking, you know, think of the indigenous people up in the north. In York, they has them sitting around in a circle with boughs on their chairs so they can tell their story and everyone can listen. You know, we could learn a lot from indigenous people. They didn't learn a whole lot from us, but we could learn a whole lot from them, you know, as to how to live with the land and water and all this.
So it's like there's various expressions of lament. One would be a situation where you're not yet, let's say, disturbed enough in terms of the security of your identity to really feel totally lost, but you're mildly nostalgic. And then you start losing more and more and more, and things start crumbling. And then lament starts, you know, you move past nostalgia, or maybe you're trying to hold on to it as much as you can, thinking that maybe we can go back. Maybe, and some people even hold on to it violently, you know, trying to go back. But then there's a certain point at which the realization finally comes that there is no going back. You know, it's destroyed. The past is gone. And now something new has to come into being. And then you're really entering into that liminal space. And that's when lament becomes really gut-wrenching, because then everything you know, not only of what you've had, but also of who you are, you have no identity anymore, even within yourself. And then there's a lament, which is, you know, it becomes an existential lament. But that's also, I mean, to go back to your image of the womb, that's also a creative space where if you're able to open yourself to the work of God in that situation, something new can come out of it. that's not to say that, I mean, what I wouldn't want to say is that's a good thing, because then that it makes too light, because a lot of times the destruction, I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell whether the destruction is the work of God or whether it's the work of humans just screwing it up and making a mess of things, right? And let's not, discount the fact that we've been responsible for a lot of the destruction. So we can have a creative space and celebrate a creative space without letting go of responsibility also, right? There's like there's a forgiveness that takes place in that, or a humility, there's like all different dimensions to lament, if
It
that makes
all
sense.
kind of sounds like different aspects of loss, though. Anger, rage,
Yeah.
possibly even denial, grief, despair, sorrow.
Yeah, I would say yeah.
So one of the things right now that as we look at Christian community, and I'm going to focus there for right now, is we're interesting people. On one hand, we are trying to be faithful. We are trying as best we can to be faithful. And yet somehow we think that can happen just by the ones who are being faithful and not involve our brothers and sisters and all of those who have been hurt and injured and whose voices need to be heard, so that we can have some kind of integrity as we try to reform, in both senses, reform what community would look like in today's world, with its many, many manifestations and celebrations, because the broader community is often way ahead of the church in this, of who people are and how they can be in relation, whether they're First Nations people, LGBTQ two-spirited people, whether they're the divorced and the remarried, whether they're the questioners within our society, whether those who are overwhelmed with anxiety in our young people.
And let me add to that, and I think this is a big part of Lament as well. People of different religions.
Yes,
Go back to the issue of feeling oneself a child of God. People of other religions feel themselves a child of God or a child of the divine. Hindus have no problem with that. Buddhists don't talk about God, but they'll understand themselves to be the children of truth in some way. Muslims, right? Christianity has had a difficult time with accepting that there are other paths to God. Just to put it out there.
The God of compassion is compassionate to all people and speaks to them in their time and culture in a way that's appropriate.
The other thing, first listening to you before, the Word of God is absolutely essential for lament, I think. These great stories of Old and New Testament, old scriptures, I think they're the anchor when you're in a liminal space.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be able to put your story and their story somehow together for any kind of real transformation, I think.
Or the Psalms. The Psalms.
Same thing.
Yeah.
1/3 of which are pretty much lament.
And that goes back to your point that the Psalms, though, are the individual ones of lament are existential. They are. That people are actually living it, right, and struggling with it, right? But I do think that, I've worked with people who wanted to become Christian, for instance, in the Roman Catholic tradition, from paganism and atheism and Muslim and all that, but it is a liminal space, as they're neither Muslim, they're neither Christian, so they're in that in between. But what keeps the whole thing moving is the Word. But the Word has to be treated very differently than we're used to.
Challenge.
It's a metaphor.
The challenge as we
They're
move forward.
metaphors. These stories are metaphors for living, I think, and not stuff for academic,
Do you,
you know.
do you think one thing that perhaps COVID and technology can teach us is that the church is not a building or an organization, but then when we are incarnated human beings, as Jesus was the incarnation of the Father, and as Christians we believe we are incarnated representatives of Christ, that everywhere we go we take Christ with us. Like, I'm just thinking of St. Patrick's Prayer because that was last week. But the breastplate, you know, of St. Patrick, Christ in me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, and Christ in the face of everyone I meet. And whether that person is Buddhist or Muslim or an atheist, if we see them as having the face of Christ, that's going to change.
And I'm going to change and enlarge that, and then we'll bring the conversation to a conclusion.
Before you do that,
Okay.
you know, the Christian church has survived of being exclusive from day one. Whatever you are, we're not. Like, if you're part of the mystery religions where women are ministers, well, we're not there. We're all men.
I'm not.
If you're, you know, if you're Protestant, then you're excluded. You know, whatever you are, I'm not. And so that's how we've lived, and that's how Anglicans have lived. You know, even in class the other day when the Anglicans said, sure, we threw rocks at Catholics. You know, so.
And Catholics threw them right back if they didn't start it.
But that's the tradition and the history that we're living with, right? Yeah, like, I mean, being exclusive has been
So
part of the world.
let us again, I'm going to draw this to conclusion,
Okay.
and take that notion of the breastplate of St. Patrick and slightly reframe it, not in its intention, but again in the exclusivity in which it's stated. And that is, I see the sacred before me, the sacred behind me, the sacred within me, the sacred in the face of all that I meet. Now, whether you name it Christ, God, whatever the name, spirit, or the unknown or unknowable that we can capture, that notion of one little reference to the painting that's behind us, which is that wrestling that goes on. The painting, which is Michelle's painting, of Jacob wrestling with the angel in the desert. And he does not come out without his wounds.
Or without a blessing.
Or without a blessing.
Wounds and a blessing.
Wounds on one hand, the blessing on the other. So that right now, if we look at our world community, our faith community, whatever it may be, we're in the struggle. And we better name that we are in the struggle. We will come out wounded, but we'll come out even more blessed. And with that, we'll bring this session to conclusion. So, thank you one and all.